It was the kind of evening that felt endless in Florida, humid, golden, the sky bruised with purple and orange as the sun dipped below the Gulf of Mexico. September 2004, hurricane season had passed without incident, and the small coastal town of Cedar Key was settling back into its quiet rhythm. Population just over 700, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where doors stayed unlocked, and where the biggest news was usually about the size of someone's catch or the price of shrimp at the docks. 23-year-old Ethan Calloway had lived in Cedar Key his entire life. He was the kind of young man people described with the same few words: reliable, quiet, good with his hands. He worked at his uncle's boat repair shop on Dock Street, a weathered building that smelled of salt, gasoline, and old wood. Ethan had grown up on the water. By the time he was 10, he could navigate the maze of mangrove channels and oyster bars around the islands better than most adults. By 20, he could strip an outboard motor down to its bolts and put it back together blindfolded. He lived in a small rental cottage on 2nd Street, a pale yellow house with a screened porch and a rusted metal roof that pinged when it rained. His neighbors were mostly retirees and fishermen. They waved at him in the mornings when he left for work, his faded blue cap pulled low, his toolbox rattling in the bed of his old Chevy pickup. Ethan wasn't much for conversation, but he was polite. He helped Mrs. Alvarez next door carry her groceries. He fixed the Henderson's dock gate without being asked. He was just ... there, part of the fabric of the town. On the evening of September 17, 2004, Ethan finished his shift at the repair shop around 6 in the evening. His uncle, Raymond Calloway, later told investigators that Ethan had seemed normal that day. Maybe a little distracted, but nothing alarming. They'd worked on a couple of outboards and patched a hull. Ethan had mentioned he was planning to take his boat out after work, just a quick run to check some crab traps he'd set earlier in the week, near Otsina, Oti Key, one of the small barrier islands northwest of town. He said he'd be back before dark, Raymond recalled in his statement to police. He always was. Ethan's boat was a 14-foot aluminum skiff with a 25-horsepower Yamaha motor. It wasn't fancy, but it was dependable. He'd bought it second-hand 3 years earlier and kept it tied up at the public dock near the boat ramp. Around 6:30 that evening, several people saw him loading a cooler and a bait bucket into the skiff. One of them was Gene Pritchard, a retired postal worker who lived on a houseboat nearby. He waved at me, Gene said later. I asked him if the traps were any good this week. He said he hadn't checked them yet, but he hoped so. That was it. He cranked the motor and headed out toward the northwest channel. The sun was still up, but sinking fast. In September, daylight lasted until around 7:30, maybe 8 o'clock if you were lucky. Ethan knew these waters like the back of his hand. He knew where the sandbars shifted with the tide, where the channels deepened, where the current could pull you sideways if you weren't paying attention. He'd made this trip 100 times, but that night, he never came back. By 9 o'clock, Ethan's girlfriend, Nicole Brennan, started to worry. She'd been expecting him to call. They'd made plans to meet up later that evening. Nothing formal, just a quiet night at her apartment in Chiefland, about 20 miles inland. Nicole worked as a waitress at a diner off Highway 19. She and Ethan had been together for almost 2 years. She described him as steady, predictable, in the best way. He always called when he said he would. He always showed up. When her phone didn't ring by 9:30, she tried calling him. No answer. She tried again at 10. Then, at 10:30, by 11, a knot of dread had settled in her stomach. She called Raymond. I asked if Ethan had come back from checking his traps, Nicole later told investigators, her voice shaking on the recording. Raymond said he hadn't heard from him. That's when we both knew something was wrong. Raymond drove down to the dock. Ethan's truck was still parked in the gravel lot near the boat ramp, the driver's side window cracked open like always. The keys weren't in the ignition. That was normal. Ethan kept them in his pocket, but the boat was gone, and Ethan wasn't answering his phone. Raymond stood on the dock for a long time, staring out at the black water. The tide was high. The wind had picked up slightly, carrying the smell of the mudflats and the distant sound of something metallic clanging against a piling. The moon was nearly full, casting a pale light over the bay, but there was no sign of Ethan's skiff, no distant hum of an outboard motor, just silence. By midnight, Raymond called the Levy County Sheriff's Office. The search began at first light on September 18. The Coast Guard launched a boat from their station in Yankee. Local fishermen and volunteers organized search parties, fanning out across the islands and channels. Florida fish and wildlife officers checked the mangrove creeks and oyster bars. Helicopters swept the coastline. Divers were called in to search the deeper channels. For 3 days, they found nothing. Then, on the morning of September 21st, a shrimper named Carlos Ruiz spotted something near the southern tip of Atsina Oti Key. It was Ethan's skiff, partially submerged in shallow water near a sandbar. The hull was intact. The motor was still attached, tilted up as if Ethan had beached the boat intentionally. Inside the skiff, investigators found his cooler, still closed, his bait bucket, a coil of rope, a tackle box, but no Ethan, and no sign of struggle. No blood, no torn clothing, nothing to suggest violence or panic. The boat looked as though it had simply been left there, waiting. Divers searched the surrounding waters. They combed the mangroves. They walked the shoreline of the island, which was little more than a strip of sand and scrub palmetto, uninhabited, except for the ruins of an old town that had been abandoned after a hurricane in the 1890s. They found nothing. Ethan Callaway had vanished. In the days that followed, theories emerged. Maybe he'd fallen overboard and drowned. Maybe he'd been struck by another boat. Maybe he'd gotten disoriented in the dark and waded into the water, only to be swept away by the current. The Gulf of Mexico was unforgiving. People had disappeared before, but those who knew Ethan didn't believe it. He was too careful, too experienced, and his boat had been found in calm, shallow water, not the kind of place where someone just slips and drowns. Nicole couldn't accept it. He wouldn't have just fallen in, she said, her voice hollow. He grew up on the water. He knew what he was doing. Raymond agreed. Something happened out there, he told investigators. I don't know what, but Ethan didn't just drown. The official search was called off after a week. The case was classified as a missing person investigation, presumed drowned, but no body was ever recovered. And as the weeks turned into months, and the months into years, the questions remained. What happened to Ethan Callaway on the evening of September 17, 2004? Why was his boat found beached and abandoned, as if he'd simply walked away? And where did he go? The answers would remain buried for a long time, longer than anyone could have imagined. But they were out there, waiting. The first few weeks after Ethan's disappearance felt like drowning in slow motion. Cedar Key was a town built on quiet routines, where news traveled fast, but rarely carried weight. But this was different. This was one of their own. And the not knowing, the absence of answers, of closure, of even a body to bury, sat heavy on the community like fog that wouldn't lift. Nicole stopped sleeping. She'd lie awake in her apartment in Chiefland, staring at the ceiling, replaying the last conversation she'd had with Ethan. It had been nothing special. He'd called her during his lunch break on September 17th. They'd talked about what to have for dinner that weekend. He'd laughed at something she said. The sound of his laugh now felt like a ghost in her memory, something she was terrified of forgetting. She drove to Cedar Key almost every day in those first weeks. She walked the docks. She stood at the edge of the water, scanning the horizon as if Ethan might suddenly appear, waving from his skiff, sheepish and apologetic for worrying everyone. But the horizon stayed empty. The water gave nothing back. Raymond kept the boat repair shop open, but he moved through the days like a man underwater. His hands did the work, tightening bolts, replacing spark plugs, patching fiberglass, but his mind was elsewhere. He replayed that last shift with Ethan, over and over, searching for something he might have missed. A strange comment, a worried glance, anything. But there was nothing. Ethan had been normal, quiet maybe, but that was just Ethan. I keep thinking he's going to walk through that door, Raymond told a local reporter, 2 months after the disappearance. His voice cracked. I keep hearing his truck pull up, but it's never him. The Levy County Sheriff's Office kept the case open, but as the weeks passed, the leads dried up. Investigators had interviewed everyone who'd seen Ethan that day. They'd reviewed his phone record, nothing unusual. They'd checked his bank account, no suspicious activity. They'd searched his cottage, looking for anything that might suggest why he'd vanished. A note, a plan, some hint of trouble. They found nothing. Ethan's life had been unremarkable in the best way. He paid his bills on time. He had no debts, no criminal record, no enemies. He didn't drink much. He didn't use drugs. He wasn't involved in anything illegal. He was just a young man who fixed boats and checked crab traps and loved a woman who waited for him to come home. Detective Laura Marsh, the lead investigator on the case, conducted dozens of interviews. She spoke with Ethan's co-workers, his neighbors, his friends from high school. Everyone said the same thing. Ethan was a good guy, dependable, not the type to just disappear. We explored every angle, Detective Marsh said in a 2005 interview with the Gainesville Sun. Accidental drowning was the most likely explanation, but without a body, we couldn't rule out other possibilities. We looked into whether he might have left voluntarily, whether there was foul play, but we found no evidence to support any of those theories. The official conclusion remained the same, presumed drowned, but it was a conclusion that satisfied no one. Rumors began to circulate, the way they always do in small towns when facts run dry. Some people whispered that Ethan had staged his own disappearance, that he'd wanted to start over somewhere far away, but those who knew him dismissed that immediately. Ethan wasn't unhappy. He had no reason to run. Others suggested something darker. Maybe he'd gotten involved with the wrong people. Drug runners occasionally used the remote islands and channels around Cedar Key to move product. Maybe Ethan had seen something he shouldn't have. Maybe he'd been silenced. But there was no evidence of that either. No signs of violence. No witnesses. No threats. And so the questions hung in the air, unanswered. Nicole tried to move forward, but forward felt like a direction that no longer existed. She kept Ethan's number in her phone. She couldn't bring herself to delete it. Sometimes, late at night, she'd scroll to his name and just stare at it, her thumb hovering over the call button. She never pressed it. She was afraid of what it would mean to hear that automated voice say the number was no longer in service. She went to therapy. She talked to a grief counselor who specialized in ambiguous loss, the kind of grief that comes from not knowing. The counselor told her it was okay to feel stuck, that it was normal to be unable to let go when there was no ending. But knowing it was normal didn't make it easier. 6 months after Ethan disappeared, Nicole packed up the few things he'd left at her apartment, a jacket, a toothbrush, a paperback book with a bookmark still in it, and brought them to Raymond. She couldn't keep them anymore. They felt like anchors. Raymond put them in a cardboard box in the back room of the shop. He couldn't throw them away. Not yet. A year passed, then 2, then 5. Cedar Key moved on, the way small towns do. New people moved in. Old people moved away. The docks stayed busy. The shrimp boats came and went. Life continued. But Ethan's absence remained, a quiet scar on the town's memory. Nicole eventually left Florida. She moved to North Carolina in 2007, took a job at a hospital, and tried to build a new life. She met someone, a kind man, who didn't ask too many questions about her past. They got married in 2009. She was happy, in a careful, cautious way. But she never stopped wondering. And every September, when the air turned humid and the sky turned that particular shade of gold, she thought of Ethan. She thought of that phone call, that laugh, that promise to meet up later. Raymond kept the shop open until 2010, when his health started to fail. He sold it to a younger man from Gainesville and moved into a retirement home in Crystal River. He brought the cardboard box with him, Ethan's things. He couldn't let them go. Detective Marsh retired in 2012. Before she left the department, she reviewed Ethan's case one last time. She reread every statement, every report. She looked at the photos of the abandoned skiff, the empty cooler, the coil of rope. She stared at Ethan's face in the missing person photo. Young, serious, with eyes that seemed to look right through the camera. I never stopped thinking about him, she said, years later. There were a lot of cases I worked that stayed with me, but Ethan's was different. It was the absence of evidence that haunted me. No body, no signs of struggle, no explanation, just ... gone. She filed the case away, marked as cold, unsolved. And for a long time, that's where it stayed. But time has a strange way of revealing things, of shaking loose secrets that were buried deep, of bringing fragments to the surface when no one is looking anymore. And in the summer of 2019, 15 years after Ethan Calloway disappeared, something finally surfaced. Something that would change everything. The summer of 2019 was brutal in Florida. Record heat, relentless sun. The kind of weather that made the air shimmer over the asphalt and turned the Gulf into a mirror of blinding light. In Cedar Key, tourists still came, but fewer than usual. The heat kept people indoors, huddled under ceiling fans and air conditioning units that rattled and groaned. On the morning of July 12, 2019, a man named Derek Pullman was clearing out his late father's property on the eastern edge of town. The house sat on a weedy lot at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by scrub pine and palmetto. It had been abandoned for nearly 3 years, ever since Derek's father, Frank Pullman, had died of a heart attack in 2016. Derek lived in Tampa now, worked in insurance, and had been putting off dealing with the property for as long as possible. But the county had started sending notices. The roof was caving in. The place was becoming a liability. So Derek drove up from Tampa with a rented dumpster and a resigned sense of duty. He spent the morning hauling out trash bags full of mildewed clothes, broken furniture, and decades of accumulated junk. His father had been a hoarder, the quiet kind, the kind who kept everything because you never knew when you might need it. By noon, Derek was drenched in sweat and ready to quit for the day, but he decided to check the old shed out back before he left. It was a small wooden structure, barely 8 feet by 10, with a rusted metal roof and walls that had gone soft with rot. The door hung crooked on its hinges. Derek had to kick it open. Inside, the air was thick and stale, smelling of mildew and old gasoline. Sunlight filtered through gaps in the wall, casting thin beams across piles of fishing gear, paint cans, coils of rope, and cardboard boxes stacked haphazardly on metal shelves. Derek sighed. More junk. He started pulling boxes down, checking their contents. Most were filled with things he didn't recognize. Old car parts, rusted tools, yellowed newspapers. But then, in the back corner, behind a stack of lobster traps, he found something that made him stop. A plastic storage bin, the kind with a snap-on lid. It was dusty, covered in cobwebs, but the lid was still sealed tight. Derek pulled it out, set it on the shed floor, and popped the lid open. Inside was a black backpack. He lifted it out carefully. It was old, faded, the fabric worn thin in places. There was a name written on the front pocket in black marker, barely legible now, the letters ghosted by time and sun. Ethan Calloway. Derek stared at the name. It didn't mean anything to him at first. He opened the backpack. Inside, he found a wallet, a cell phone, ancient by 2019 standards, a flip phone with a scratched screen, a set of keys, a folded piece of paper, and a small digital camera, the kind people used before smartphones. Derek pulled out the wallet and opened it. Inside was a Florida driver's license. The photo showed a young man with short dark hair and serious eyes. Ethan Michael Calloway. Job, 03, 1 April, tahun 1981. Derek's stomach tightened. He didn't know the name, but something about finding a stranger's belongings in his dead father's shed felt deeply wrong. He pulled out his phone and called the Levy County Sheriff's Office. Deputy Isaac Torres arrived at the property within an hour. He was young, mid-30s, and had only been with the department for 6 years. But he'd heard the name Ethan Calloway before. Everyone in the department had. It was one of those cases that lingered in the file room, gathering dust but never quite forgotten. Derek showed him the backpack. Deputy Torres pulled on a pair of latex gloves and examined the contents carefully. The wallet, the phone, the keys. He held the driver's license up to the light, comparing the photo to the image he remembered from the missing person flyer that still hung in the department's cold case files. It was him, no question. Do you know who this person is? Torres asked Derek. Derek shook his head. Never heard of him. I just found it in the shed. My dad's been dead for 3 years. I don't know how long that's been sitting there. Torres nodded slowly. Ethan Calloway disappeared in 2004, 15 years ago. He went out on his boat one night and never came back. They found the boat, but not him. Derek's face went pale. You think my dad had something to do with it? I don't know, Torres said carefully, but we need to find out. He bagged the backpack and its contents as evidence and took them back to the station. Within hours, the case was reopened. Detective James Cavach, who had taken over cold cases after Laura Marsh retired, was assigned to lead the investigation. Cavach was methodical, thorough. He reviewed the original case files, refreshing his memory on the details. Then he examined the backpack. Everything inside was exactly as it had been 15 years ago. The wallet still had $23 in cash. The keys, one for a truck, one for a house, one small key that probably opened a padlock. The phone was dead, its battery long expired, but it was intact. And the camera, Cavach turned the camera over in his hands. It was a small Sony Cybershot, the kind that was popular in the early 2000s. He pressed the power button, not expecting anything. But to his surprise, a faint glow appeared on the screen. The battery had just enough charge left to flicker to life for a few seconds before dying again. He took the camera to the department's tech specialist, a civilian contractor named Megan Yates, who handled digital forensics. She connected the camera to a power source and began extracting the images from its memory card. There were 43 photos in total. Most were mundane. Pictures of boats, the docks, the water. A few shots of Ethan and Nicole together, smiling, their arms around each other. But then, near the end of the roll, there were 3 photos that made Kvetch lean closer to the screen. They were taken at dusk. The light was fading, the sky a deep bruised purple. The photos showed a small island, probably Atsina Otiki, judging by the landscape. In the foreground was Ethan's skiff, pulled up onto the sand. And in the background, barely visible in the dim light, was another boat. A larger vessel, maybe 18 feet, with a white hull and a blue stripe. 2 figures stood near it, their faces obscured by shadow and distance. The photos were blurry, taken quickly, as if Ethan had been trying to capture something without being noticed. Kvetch stared at the images for a long time. Then he asked Megan to enhance them, to pull out as much detail as possible. It took her 2 days. When she was finished, the images were clearer, not perfect, but better. The 2 figures were men. One was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark cap. The other was shorter, thinner, with something in his hands. It was hard to tell what. A box, maybe, or a bag. And in the last photo, taken from a slightly different angle, Kvetch could just barely make out the registration numbers on the side of the white boat. He ran the numbers. The boat had been registered to Frank Pullman. The pieces were starting to come together, but the picture they formed was fragmented, incomplete. Kvetch needed to know more about Frank Pullman, who he was, what he did, why Ethan Calloway's belongings had been hidden in his shed. He started digging into Pullman's background. Frank had been a commercial fisherman for most of his life. He'd lived in Cedar Key, on and off, for decades, working the waters around the islands, catching mullet, grouper, and stone crab. He'd had a reputation as a hard worker, but also as someone who kept to himself, quiet, private, not unfriendly, but not warm either. In 2004, Frank had been 52 years old. He'd lived in the same house on the dirt road, the one Derek was now clearing out. He'd fished alone, mostly. Occasionally, he'd hire day labor to help with the traps, but not often. Kvetch interviewed several people who'd known Frank. Most had little to say. He was just a fisherman, did his job, paid his bills, stayed out of trouble. But then Kvetch spoke with a man named Vernon Hayes, a retired fisherman who'd worked the same waters as Frank back in the day. Vernon was in his 70s now, living in a mobile home park in Inglis. He remembered Frank Pullman. Frank was a strange one, Vernon said, leaning back in a lawn chair on his cluttered porch. Never talked much, but he was always out there, day and night, working those traps. Sometimes I'd see him out by Atsina Oti, near the old ruins. He liked that area, said the crabbing was good out there. Do you remember anything unusual around September 2004? Kvetch asked. Around the time Ethan Calloway disappeared. Vernon was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant. Then he nodded slowly. Yeah, actually, I do. I saw Frank a few days after that kid went missing. He was at the dock, loading up his boat. I asked him if he'd heard about the search. He said he had, but he didn't seem... I don't know. He didn't seem concerned. Most of us were out there helping look for the kid, but not Frank. He just kept working. Did you ever see Frank with Ethan, or near Ethan's skiff? Vernon shook his head. No. But I saw Frank's boat out by Atsina Oti the night that kid disappeared. I remember because I was heading back in just after sunset, and I passed him going the other way. He was alone. Kvetch took notes. Then he asked the question that had been sitting in the back of his mind since he'd seen the photos. Do you think Frank could have been involved in something illegal? Drug running, maybe. Vernon's expression darkened. I don't know. People talked, you know. There were always rumors about guys running drugs through the islands. It was easy money if you knew the channels. Frank knew the channels better than anybody. Kvetch left Vernon's trailer with more questions than answers, but he had a direction now, a thread to pull. Back at the station, he reviewed the photos again. The 2 men, the boat, the shadowy figures in the fading light. And he thought about Ethan Calloway, 23 years old, alone on the water, checking his crab traps. What had Ethan seen that night? And why had Frank Pullman kept his backpack hidden for 15 years? The investigation moved carefully now, like someone walking through a room full of broken glass. Every step mattered. Every piece of evidence had to be documented, preserved, analyzed. Detective Kvetch knew he was dealing with something that had been buried for 15 years, and he couldn't afford to make mistakes. He started by trying to recover data from Ethan's old cell phone. The battery was dead, corroded beyond repair, but the SIM card was still intact. Megan Yates, the tech specialist, managed to extract the call and text logs. Most of it was routine calls to Nicole, to Raymond, to a few friends. Nothing unusual. But there was one number that appeared multiple times in the days leading up to Ethan's disappearance. A local number. Kvetch ran it through the database. It had belonged to a man named Colin Briggs. The name meant nothing to Kvetch at first. He searched the department's records. Colin Briggs had no criminal history in Levy County. No arrests, no warrants. But when Kvetch ran a broader search through state and federal databases, something came up. In 1998, Colin Briggs had been questioned by federal agents in connection with a drug trafficking investigation in the Florida Keys. No charges were filed. The case went cold, but his name was there, flagged as a person of interest. Kvetch felt the familiar tingle of a lead solidifying. He dug deeper. Colin Briggs had lived in Cedar Key in the early 2000s. He'd worked odd jobs, deckhands, construction, dock work. He'd left town abruptly in late 2004, just a few weeks after Ethan disappeared. According to public records, he'd moved to Georgia, then North Carolina, then dropped off the map entirely around 2007. Kvetch put out a request to locate Briggs. It took 3 days, but they found him. He was living in a rural town outside Asheville, North Carolina, working at a hardware store under his own name. No aliases, no attempt to hide. Kvetch and another detective, Sarah Pinto, flew to North Carolina to interview him. Colin Briggs was 49 years old. Now he looked older. His face was lined, weathered, his hair thin and graying. He lived alone in a small rental house at the end of a gravel road, surrounded by trees. When Kvetch and Pinto knocked on his door, he didn't seem surprised. "I wondered when someone would come," he said quietly. They sat in his small, cluttered kitchen. Briggs made coffee, his hands shaking slightly as he poured. Kvetch watched him carefully. There was something about the man, a kind of exhaustion, a weight that had been carried for too long. "We're here to talk about Ethan Calloway," Kvetch said. Briggs nodded. He didn't look up. "I figured. We found his belongings in Frank Pullman's shed. We also found photos on Ethan's camera. Photos of you and Frank, on Atsinaoti Key the night Ethan disappeared." Briggs was silent for a long moment. Then he exhaled slowly and set his coffee cup down. "I've been waiting 15 years to tell someone," he said. "I just didn't know how." Kvetch leaned forward. "Tell us now," and Colin Briggs did. He started at the beginning. In 2003, Briggs had gotten involved with a group of men who were running marijuana and cocaine through the Gulf Coast, using small boats and isolated islands as transfer points. It wasn't a sophisticated operation, just a handful of guys moving product from the Keys up to the Panhandle, selling it to distributors inland. Briggs had been desperate for money. His marriage had fallen apart. He'd lost his job. When Frank Pullman approached him with an offer to make quick cash, he'd said yes. Frank was the one with the connections. He knew the waters. He knew the islands. He knew which spots were remote enough to avoid the Coast Guard and the Marine Patrol. For over a year, they'd been making runs at night, picking up shipments from boats out in the Gulf, and ferrying them to drop points along the coast. It was dangerous work, but it paid well. And for a while, everything went smoothly. Until September 17th, 2004. "We were supposed to do a pickup that night," Briggs said, his voice low. "Frank and we met at Atsinaoti around sunset. The plan was to wait until dark, then head out to meet the supply boat about 10 miles offshore. But while we were waiting, we saw another boat coming, a small skiff. We didn't think much of it at first. Lots of people fish those waters." He paused, his jaw tightening. "But then the skiff came closer, and we realized it was Ethan Calloway. Frank knew him. Everyone in Cedar Key knew Ethan. He was out checking crab traps." Kvetch's pen hovered over his notepad. "What happened? Ethan pulled his skiff up onto the beach, not far from where we were. He was friendly, said hello, asked what we were doing out there. Frank told him we were just fishing, waiting for the tide to change. Ethan seemed to buy it. He walked down the beach a little ways to check one of his traps. Briggs rubbed his face with both hands. But then he came back, and he had his camera. I saw him taking pictures. Not of us, exactly. Of our boat. The registration numbers, I could tell he'd figured something out. Maybe he'd seen us there before, in strange places, at strange times. Or maybe he just got a bad feeling. I don't know. Frank saw it too. And he panicked. Kvetch felt his pulse quicken. What did Frank do? Briggs looked up, his eyes red. He told Ethan we needed to talk. He tried to play it cool, like it was no big deal. But Ethan wasn't stupid. He knew something was wrong. He started backing toward his skiff. Frank went after him. I told Frank to leave it alone, Briggs said, his voice cracking. I told him we could just leave. We could call off the pickup, get out of there. But Frank was scared. He said Ethan would go to the cops. He said we'd both go to prison. Briggs stopped. He stared at his hands. Frank grabbed Ethan. They struggled. Ethan tried to get away, but Frank was bigger, stronger. He pushed Ethan down onto the sand. I was yelling at him to stop. But Frank, ... single quotes, Briggs trailed off, his voice barely a whisper. Frank held him down, held his face in the water. The room went silent. Kvetch felt a cold knot in his stomach. How long? Kvetch asked quietly. I don't know. A minute, maybe 2. It felt like forever. When Frank finally let go, Ethan wasn't moving. Briggs sat back in his chair, his face ashen. Frank checked for a pulse. There wasn't one. Ethan was gone. Pinto spoke for the first time, her voice measured. What did you do with the body? Briggs closed his eyes. We weighted it down. Used some cinder blocks Frank had in his boat. We took Ethan's body out into the channel, about half a mile offshore, where the current was strong. We dropped him there. What about his belongings? Kvetch asked. Frank took his backpack, said we couldn't leave it in the skiff. Someone might find it and start asking questions. We left the skiff beached on the island, made it look like Ethan had just wandered off or drowned. Then we called off the pickup and went home. Briggs opened his eyes. I wanted to turn myself in. I really did. But Frank said, if I talked, he'd make sure I went down for murder. He said it was my fault for being there, for being part of it. So I kept my mouth shut, and I've been carrying it ever since. Why did Frank keep the backpack? Pinto asked. Why not destroy it? Briggs shook his head. I don't know. Maybe insurance. Maybe guilt. Frank was a strange guy. He didn't talk much about feeling, but I think it ate at him, what we did. He never ran drugs again after that night. He just went back to fishing, like nothing happened. But I could tell something had changed in him. Kvetch leaned back, processing everything. Why didn't you come forward after Frank died? I thought about it, Briggs said. But what good would it do? Ethan was already gone. Frank was dead. I'd just be putting myself in prison for something that couldn't be undone. But I knew eventually it would come out. I knew I couldn't run from it forever. Kvetch and Pinto left North Carolina with a full recorded confession. They flew back to Florida and began the process of verifying Briggs's account. Divers were sent to the coordinates Briggs had provided, the area where he claimed they'd dumped Ethan's body. The search took 5 days. The currents in that area were strong, and 15 years was a long time. But on the 6th day, they found something. A set of remains, tangled in an old fishing net, weighted down by cinder blocks. The bones were sent to the state medical examiner's office for analysis. 3 weeks later, DNA testing confirmed it. The remains belonged to Ethan Michael Calloway. Nicole got the call on a Tuesday afternoon in October 2019. She was at work in the middle of her shift at the hospital when her phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but something made her step outside to answer it. It was Detective Kvetch. He told her they'd found Ethan. He told her what had happened. He told her it hadn't been an accident. Nicole didn't say anything for a long time. She just stood there in the parking lot, the phone pressed to her ear, the world spinning around her. Thank you, she finally whispered. Thank you for not giving up. When she hung up, she sat down on the curb and cried for the first time in years. Not because she'd lost him, she'd known he was gone for a long time, but because she finally had an answer. Because the not knowing, the wondering, the terrible open-ended grief was finally over. Raymond was in his room at the retirement home when he heard the news. His son called him, voice shaking, and told him everything. Raymond listened in silence. When the call ended, he sat on the edge of his bed and stared at the cardboard box in the corner, the one with Ethan's jacket, his toothbrush, his book. He didn't cry. He'd cried enough over the years, but he felt something shift inside him, a weight lifting, just slightly. Not gone, but lighter. I knew you didn't just drown, he said quietly, to the empty room. I knew Colin Briggs was arrested and charged with manslaughter and accessory to murder. He pleaded guilty to both charges and was sentenced to 18 years in prison. He didn't fight it at his sentence. He read a statement apologizing to Ethan's family, to Nicole, to Raymond. He said he knew it would never be enough, but it was all he had to give. Frank Pullman was dead, and so there would be no trial, no justice in the traditional sense. But the truth was out, and sometimes that was all anyone could hope for. Ethan's remains were cremated. Nicole and Raymond held a small memorial service at the docks in Cedar Key, the place where Ethan had spent so much of his life. A few dozen people came, old friends, neighbors, people who still remembered the quiet young man who'd fixed their boats and checked his crab traps on warm September evening. They scattered his ashes over the water, just as the sun was setting. The sky turned gold and purple, the way it always did. The water was calm, the wind was soft, and for the first time in 15 years, Ethan Callaway came home. In the months that followed, the case was officially closed. The story made regional headlines. A few true crime podcasts covered it. But eventually, the attention faded, the way it always does. Life went on. Nicole returned to North Carolina. She thought about Ethan often, but the thoughts were different now, less haunted, more at peace. Raymond passed away quietly in his sleep in 2021. 2 years after Ethan's remains were found, his family buried him next to his wife, in a cemetery overlooking the Gulf, and Cedar Key remained what it had always been, a small, quiet town on the edge of the water, where the tides came and went, and where the past lingered, just beneath the surface, waiting to be found. There are some stories that don't end cleanly. They don't wrap up with all the answers neatly tied together, with every question resolved and every person made whole again. Ethan Callaway's story was one of those. The truth had been found. Yes, the missing pieces had been uncovered, but the truth didn't undo 15 years of waiting. It didn't bring Ethan back, and it didn't erase the scars left behind on the people who loved him. Detective James Cavach kept a copy of the case file on his desk for months after it was officially closed. He'd open it sometimes, late at night when the station was quiet, and look at the photos. Ethan's face in the missing person flyer, the abandoned skiff on the sandbar, the blurry images from the camera, showing 2 men in the fading light. He thought about how close the case had come to never being solved. If Derek Pullman hadn't decided to clean out that shed, if Frank Pullman had destroyed the backpack instead of hiding it, if the camera battery had died completely before Megan could extract the photos. So many small moments, each one a thread that could have snapped, but they hadn't, and somehow, against all odds, the truth had survived. Cavach retired from the Levy County Sheriff's Office in 2022. At his retirement party, someone asked him which case he was most proud of solving. He didn't hesitate. Ethan Callaway, he said, because it mattered to people who never stopped caring. Nicole Brennan, now Nicole Torres, after remarrying, never returned to Cedar Key, but she kept a small photo of Ethan in a drawer in her bedroom. It was from the summer of 2003, a year before he disappeared. They'd gone to St. Augustine for the weekend, walked along the old fort, eaten ice cream on the seawall. Ethan was smiling in the photo, genuinely smiling, the kind of smile that reached his eyes. She didn't look at the photo often, but knowing it was there, knowing she could look at it when she wanted to, brought her a quiet kind of comfort. She had 2 children now, a boy and a girl. They didn't know about Ethan. They were too young to understand. But someday, when they were older, she'd tell them. She'd tell them about a boy who loved the water, who fixed boats with his hands, who was kind and steady and taken too soon. She'd tell them so they'd know that the people we lose don't really disappear. They stay with us, in the small ways we carry them forward. In 2023, on what would have been Ethan's 42nd birthday, Nicole drove down to the coast with her husband. Not to Cedar Key, she couldn't bring herself to go back there, but to a quiet beach farther south, near Clearwater. They walked along the shore at sunset, the water lapping at their feet, the sky turning shades of orange and pink. She didn't say anything. She just watched the horizon, the endless stretch of water, and thought about the boy who'd once promised to call her later. She thought about how much time had passed, how much life had happened, and how, despite everything, she was okay. Raymond Callaway had kept Ethan's things in that cardboard box for years. The jacket, the toothbrush, the paperback book. After Ethan's remains were found, and the memorial service was held, Raymond finally allowed himself to let some of it go. He donated the jacket to a thrift store. He threw away the toothbrush, but he kept the book. It was a dog-eared copy of The Old Man and the Sea by Hemingway. Ethan had been reading it in the weeks before he disappeared. The bookmark was still tucked inside, about 2/3 of the way through. Raymond had never been much of a reader, but one afternoon, sitting in his room at the retirement home, he picked up the book and started from the beginning. He read it slowly, a few pages at a time. It took him weeks to finish, but when he did, he understood why Ethan had liked it. It was a story about perseverance, about a man fighting against something bigger than himself, about loss and dignity and the quiet strength it takes to keep going. When Raymond died in 2021, the book was found on his nightstand. His family didn't know what to do with it, so they left it at the memorial service, alongside the photos and flowers. One of Ethan's old high school friends, a man named Travis, who'd moved away years ago but had come back for the service, picked it up and read the inscription on the inside cover. To Ethan, keep your head up. Love, Mum. Travis took the book home with him. He didn't know why. It just felt wrong to leave it there. A few months later, he donated it to the Cedar Key Library, along with a small plaque that read, "In memory of Ethan Calloway, 1981 to 2004, a son of Cedar Key." The book still sits on the shelf there, in the local history section. Sometimes people check it out, sometimes they don't. But it's there, a small piece of Ethan, still present in the town that raised him. Derek Pullman never went back to his father's property. After the investigation concluded and the shed was cleared out, he sold the land to a developer who tore down the house and built a small vacation rental in its place. Derek didn't attend the demolition. He didn't want to see it. For a long time, he struggled with what his father had done. Frank Pullman had been a hard man, distant and often cold, but Derek had never thought of him as a murderer. Learning the truth that his father had killed someone, had hidden it for years, had carried that secret to his grave, shattered something inside Derek. He went to therapy. He talked to a counselor who specialized in trauma and family dynamics. Slowly, over months and then years, he began to separate his father's actions from his own identity. He learned that he wasn't responsible for what Frank had done, that he couldn't have known, that guilt by association wasn't the same as guilt itself. In 2020, Derek wrote a letter to Nicole. He didn't know if she'd read it, or if she'd even want to hear from him, but he wrote it anyway. In the letter, he apologized, not for what his father had done. He knew that wasn't his to apologize for, but for the years of silence, for the fact that Ethan's belongings had been hidden in a place Derek owned, even if he hadn't known they were there. He mailed the letter and didn't expect a response, but 3 weeks later, Nicole wrote back. Her letter was short, just a few lines. She thanked him for reaching out. She told him she didn't blame him. She told him that everyone carries the weight of the people they come from, and that the best thing he could do was live his life differently. Derek kept that letter in his wallet for years. Colin Briggs served his sentence quietly. He didn't cause trouble. He didn't try to appeal his conviction. He worked in the prison library, shelving books, helping other inmates with their legal paperwork. He attended therapy sessions. He wrote letters to Nicole and Raymond, even though he knew they might never be read. Most of them weren't, but one was. In 2021, a few months before Raymond passed away, he opened one of Briggs's letters. He didn't know why. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was a need for closure. Or maybe it was just time. The letter was simple. Briggs apologized again. He didn't make excuses. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He just said he was sorry, and that he thought about Ethan every day. He said he hoped, somehow, that telling the truth had brought some peace to the people Ethan had left behind. Raymond folded the letter and put it in the drawer next to his bed. He never responded, but he didn't throw it away either. When Colin Briggs was released from prison in 2037, he'd be 67 years old. He didn't know what he'd do with the rest of his life, but he knew he'd carry Ethan Calloway with him until the end. Cedar Key didn't change much in the years after the case was solved. The tourists still came in the spring and fall. The shrimp boats still went out at dawn. The docks still creaked and groaned with the tide. But there was a small memorial now, near the boat ramp where Ethan used to launch his skiff. It was simple, just a bronze plaque mounted on a wooden post, with Ethan's name and dates, and a single line beneath. Gone, but not forgotten. People passed by it every day. Most didn't stop, but some did. Some stood there for a moment, reading the plaque, thinking about the story behind it, thinking about a young man who'd gone out to check his crab traps one September evening and never came home. And sometimes, late in the afternoon, when the light turned golden and the water was calm, you could see someone standing at the end of the dock, looking out at the horizon. Maybe it was Nicole, visiting from North Carolina. Maybe it was one of Ethan's old friends. Maybe it was just a stranger who'd heard the story and wanted to pay their respects. Whoever it was, they'd stand there quietly, watching the water, and they'd think about how fragile life is, how quickly someone can be here and then gone, how the answers we search for don't always heal us, but they give us something to hold on to, and maybe that's enough. There are stories that fade with time, and there are stories that linger. Ethan Calloway's story was the latter. It became part of Cedar Key's history, woven into the fabric of the town like the saltwater and the tides. It became a reminder that even in the quietest places, tragedy can find its way in. And that, sometimes, years later, the truth finds its way out. Detective Laura Marsh, who'd worked the case in its earliest days, heard about the resolution in 2019. She was living in Georgia by then, retired and spending her days gardening and visiting her grandchildren. When a former colleague called to tell her they'd found Ethan, she sat down on her porch and cried. "I never stopped thinking about him," she told her husband that night. "All these years, I never stopped." She wrote a letter to Kvetch, congratulating him on solving the case. She told him she was proud of him, that Ethan's family deserved the truth, and that he'd given it to them. Kvetch framed the letter and hung it on his office wall. In the end, what remains of Ethan Calloway isn't just the case file, or the memorial plaque, or the ashes scattered over the water. What remains is the impact he had on the people who knew him. The memory of his quiet kindness, the way he fixed things without being asked, the way he loved the water, and the simple, steady rhythm of his life. And what remains is the reminder that every disappearance is a story. Every missing person is someone's son, someone's partner, someone's friend. And every unsolved case is a wound that doesn't heal until the truth is found. Ethan's truth took 15 years to surface, but it did surface. And in that, there is something, not justice, perhaps, but something close to it, a reckoning, a closing of the circle. Nicole said it best. In an interview she gave to a local news station in 2020, "I'll never get those 15 years back," she said, her voice steady. "I'll never get Ethan back, but I have the truth now, and I have peace. And that's more than a lot of families ever get." The water off Cedar Key still looks the same as it did in 2004. The tides still rise and fall. The sun still sets in shades of gold and purple. The islands still sit quiet and untouched, guarded by mangroves and oyster bars. But if you listen closely, on certain evenings when the wind is calm and the water is still, you can almost hear the echo of an outboard motor humming in the distance, the sound of a young man heading out to check his traps, steady and sure, confident in the water that raised him. And maybe, just maybe, that's how Ethan would want to be remembered. Not as a victim, not as a tragedy, but as someone who belonged to the water, who lived simply and loved deeply, and who, in the end, was finally brought home. Sometimes, the silence speaks louder than any confession. Sometimes, truth survives only in the memories of those who still wait. And sometimes, after all the searching and all the grief, the answer is this: he was loved, he is remembered, and his story will not be forgotten. Even after the truth came out, after Colin Briggs confessed and Ethan's remains were found, there were still pieces of the story that didn't quite fit, small details that nagged at investigators, threads that had been pulled but never fully unraveled. Cold cases are like that sometimes. Even when you find the answer, you realize the answer isn't complete. Detective James Kvetch felt it most acutely. In the months after the case was officially closed, he'd wake up in the middle of the night, thinking about the things that still didn't make sense, the holes in the narrative, the questions that Briggs either couldn't or wouldn't answer fully. One of those questions was about the camera. Ethan's digital camera had been found in the backpack, hidden in Frank Pullman's shed for 15 years. The photos on it had been crucial to solving the case. The images of Frank's boat, the shadowy figures, the registration numbers, but there was something about those photos that bothered Kvetch, something he couldn't quite articulate at first. It wasn't until he was reviewing the case file one last time, preparing to archive it permanently, that he realized what it was. The timestamp on the photos, the last 3 images, the ones showing Frank's boat and the 2 men, had been taken at 7:43 p.m., 7:44 p.m., and 7:46 p.m. on September 17, 2004. But, according to Briggs's confession, the confrontation with Ethan hadn't happened until after dark, sometime around 8:30 or 9 p.m. That meant There was almost an hour unaccounted for. What had happened during that hour? Why had Ethan stayed on the island after taking those photos? And more importantly, had he taken any other photos that hadn't survived? Kvetch called Megan Yates, the tech specialist who'd extracted the images from the camera. Is there any way to tell if photos were deleted from that memory card? He asked. Megan was quiet for a moment. Potentially. If they were deleted recently, we could recover them. But after 15 years, it's unlikely. The data would have degraded significantly. But possible. Possible, she said. But I'd need the original memory card, and it would take time. Kvetch retrieved the memory card from evidence storage and brought it back to Megan. She spent 3 days running advanced recovery software, trying to pull fragments of deleted data from the card's corrupted sector. On the 4th day, she called him. I found something, she said. It's not much, just fragments, but there was definitely another photo. Maybe 2. They were deleted, probably manually, sometime before the camera was turned off. Can you reconstruct them? Partially. The image quality is going to be terrible, but I can give you something. What Megan recovered was a ghost of a photograph. The colors were distorted, the resolution barely recognizable, but you could make out shapes, figures, and in the center of the frame, partially visible through the digital noise, was a third person. Not Frank Pullman. Not Colin Briggs. Someone else. Kvetch stared at the reconstructed image for a long time. The figure was blurry, indistinct, but clearly present. Tall, wearing what looked like a light-colored shirt, standing near Frank's boat, partially turned away from the camera. Who the hell is that? Kvetch muttered. He went back through Briggs's statements, looking for any mention of a third person. There was nothing. Briggs had been adamant that it was just him and Frank on the island that night. No one else, but the photo suggested otherwise. Kvetch brought the image to Colin Briggs. By now, Briggs had been transferred to a medium security facility in Central Florida. Kvetch drove 3 hours to see him, carrying a printed copy of the reconstructed photo. They sat across from each other in a small interview room, the same sterile fluorescent lighting that existed in every prison Kvetch had ever visited. He slid the photo across the table. Who is this? Kvetch asked. Briggs looked at the image. His face went pale. I don't know, he said quietly. You're lying. Briggs shook his head. I'm not, I swear. There was no one else there that night. Just me and Frank. Kvetch leaned forward. Then why is there a third person in Ethan's photo? Briggs stared at the image, his jaw tight. I don't know. Maybe it's from a different day. Maybe Ethan took that photo earlier. The timestamp says otherwise. Briggs said nothing, but Kvetch could see it in his eyes. The flicker of something. Fear, maybe, or uncertainty. Colin, Kvetch said, his voice low. If there's something you're not telling me, now's the time. Because if someone else was involved, and you're protecting them, that's obstruction. That's more time added to your sentence. Briggs looked up. His hands were shaking. I told you everything I know. Everything Frank told me. If there was someone else there, he never said anything about it. Kvetch left the prison with more questions than answers. Back in Cedar Key, Kvetch started digging into Frank Pullman's life again, looking for connections he might have missed. He interviewed more people who'd known Frank. He reviewed his phone records from 2004. He checked financial transactions, looking for any unusual payments or deposits. And then, buried in Frank's old landline record, he found something. In the 3 days leading up to Ethan's disappearance, Frank had made several calls to the same number, a local number. Kvetch ran it. It belonged to a man named Vincent Kearney. The name was vaguely familiar. Kvetch searched the department's database. Vincent Kearney had been questioned in 2001 in connection with a bar fight in Chiefland. No charges were filed. He'd also been pulled over twice in 2003 for minor traffic violations, but nothing serious. Kvetch dug deeper. Vincent Kearney had lived in Cedar Key in the early 2000s. He'd worked as a mechanic at a small garage on the outskirts of town. He'd left Florida in 2005, just a few months after Ethan disappeared, and moved to Louisiana. According to records, he'd bounced around for a few years. Louisiana, Texas, Alabama. Before settling in a small town outside Mobile in 2010, Kvetch put in a request to the Mobile Police Department to locate Kearney. It took 2 weeks, but they found him. He was still living in the same town, working at an auto body shop. Kvetch and Detective Pinto flew to Alabama. Vincent Kearney was 56 years old now. He was a big man, barrel-chested, with graying hair and grease-stained hands. He didn't seem surprised when the detectives showed up at his workplace. He didn't seem nervous either, just tired. They sat in the small office at the back of the shop, the smell of motor oil and paint thinner, heavy in the air. "We're investigating the death of Ethan Calloway," Kvetch said. "Do you remember him?" Kearney nodded slowly. "I heard about that. They found him, right, a couple years ago." "That's right. And we found evidence that you knew Frank Pullman." Kearney's expression didn't change. "I knew Frank. We worked together sometimes. He needed boat repairs. I did the work. You were in contact with him in September 2004, right before Ethan disappeared." Kearney was quiet for a moment. Then he sighed. "Yeah, I was." Kvetch pulled out the reconstructed photo and placed it on the desk. "Is this you?" Kearney looked at the image. His jaw tightened. Then he nodded. "Yeah," he said quietly. "That's me, Vincent." Kearney's story was both similar to and different from Colin Briggs's. He confirmed that he'd been involved in the drug operation with Frank and Colin. He'd been the one who handled logistics, finding buyers, arranging drop points, making sure the money got where it needed to go. He was good with numbers, good with people. He was the middleman. On the night of September 17, 2004, Vincent had been on Atsina Otiki with Frank and Colin, waiting for the pickup. He'd arrived separately, in his own boat, about 20 minutes before Ethan showed up. "I saw the kid pull up in his skiff," Vincent said. "I didn't think much of it. People fished that area all the time. But then Frank got nervous. He said the kid was asking too many questions. Said he had a camera." "What did you do?" Vincent looked down at his hands. "I told Frank to let it go. I said we'd call off the pickup, wait a few days, come back when things cooled down. But Frank wasn't listening. He was panicking, and when Frank panicked, he got dangerous." "Did you see what happened?" Vincent hesitated. Then he nodded. "I saw Frank go after the kid. I saw them struggle. I yelled at him to stop, but he wouldn't. And then, ... single quotes, he trailed off, his voice breaking. And then, it was over." "Why didn't you stop him?" "I tried, but by the time I got there, it was too late." Kvetch leaned forward. "Colin Briggs said there were only 2 people on the island that night. Why did he lie?" Vincent shook his head. "He didn't lie. He didn't know I was there. I'd gone back to my boat before the kid showed up. I was getting something from the cabin. By the time I came back, Frank had already grabbed the kid. Colin saw what happened, but he never saw me. And I made sure of it. Why? Because I didn't want to be involved. I didn't want my name anywhere near this, so I left. I got in my boat, and I left. And I never said a word to anyone." Kvetch felt a cold anger settling in his chest. "You let Colin take the fall alone. You let him carry the weight of this for 15 years, and you said nothing." Vincent's eyes were red. "I know, and I've lived with that every day since, but I was scared. I had a family. I had a life. And I convinced myself that if I just disappeared, if I just stayed quiet, it would all go away. But it didn't." "No," Vincent said quietly. "It didn't." Kvetch arrested Vincent Kearney that afternoon. He was charged with accessory to murder and obstruction of justice. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 12 years in prison. Colin Briggs, upon learning that Vincent had been on the island that night, felt a strange mixture of relief and anger. Relief that he hadn't been the only one. Anger that Vincent had let him believe he was. But mostly, he felt tired. Tired of carrying the weight alone. The discovery of Vincent Kearney's involvement didn't change the fundamental truth of what had happened to Ethan Calloway. Frank Pullman had killed him. Colin Briggs had helped dispose of the body. Vincent Kearney had been a witness and had fled. The story remained the same, but it added a layer of complexity. It showed how many people had been touched by that one terrible night. How many lives had been altered, fractured, broken. And it reminded Kvetch of something he'd learned long ago. The truth is rarely simple, and closure, real closure, is almost always incomplete. Nicole heard about Vincent Kearney's arrest through a phone call from Detective Kvetch. She listened quietly as he explained what had been discovered. When he finished, she was silent for a long time. "Does it change anything?" she finally asked. "Not really," Kvetch admitted. "We know what happened. We know who was responsible. This just fills in another piece of the picture." "Will there ever be a complete picture?" Kvetch thought about that. "Probably not, but we're closer than we were." Nicole thanked him and hung up. She sat on her porch for a while, watching the sun set, thinking about Ethan, thinking about all the people who'd been on that island that night, all the choices that had been made, all the ways things could have gone differently. And she thought about how much energy she'd spent over the years trying to understand, trying to make sense of something that would never fully make sense. In the end, she decided, maybe that was okay. Maybe some things weren't meant to be fully understood. Maybe the best you could do was accept the truth you had, incomplete as it was, and keep living. In 2024, a documentary filmmaker named Sarah Ortiz reached out to Detective Kavich about making a film on Ethan's case. She'd been researching unsolved mysteries in the Gulf Coast region and had come across the story. She wanted to tell it fully, with interviews, archival footage, and a deep dive into the investigation. Kavich agreed to participate, as did Nicole, Raymond's son, and several others who'd been close to the case. Colin Briggs and Vincent Kearney both declined to be interviewed, but their statements were included in the film through court records and audio recordings. The documentary, titled The Water Keeps Secrets, premiered at a small film festival in Tallahassee in early 2025. It didn't win any awards, but it reached people. It told Ethan's story in a way that honored him, that respected the complexity of the case, and that reminded viewers that behind every cold case is a human life, a family, and a community forever changed. After the screening, a woman in her 60s approached Kavich. She introduced herself as Margaret Calloway, Ethan's mother. She'd been too ill to attend the original memorial service, but she'd watched the documentary online. "Thank you," she said, tears in her eyes. "Thank you for not forgetting my son." Kavich hugged her, something he rarely did with anyone connected to a case. But in that moment, it felt right. "I never forgot," he said. "None of us did." Cedar Key remains a quiet town. The memorial plaque near the boat ramp is still there, weathered now but still legible. People still pass by it. Some still stop. And on certain evenings, when the light is just right and the water is calm, you can still feel the presence of a young man who loved these waters, who lived here, who died here, and who, in the end, was not forgotten. The case is closed. The truth has been told, but the echo remains. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the echo is what matters most. Because as long as people remember, as long as the story is told, Ethan Calloway is still here, still part of the fabric of this place, still real. And in a world where so many disappear without a trace, without a name, without a story that means something, it means everything.